When I went to buy my first car, I was naturally excited about it, and so I was telling basically anyone who would listen about this new car that I was purchasing. Well, new. And you could see their concern when I said that it had just about 200,000 miles on it. So they'd warned me that buying a car with high mileage leads to nothing but trouble. It's a ticking time bomb. Well, actually, I bought that car and then proceeded to put another 60,000 miles on it, and it would still be on the road today if it wasn't for some idiot in an old Jeep with bald BFG all-terrain tires racing to beat a stoplight in the middle of a snowstorm. Now I'm down in Texas, where a vehicle isn't considered high mileage unless it's got 270,000 miles, and the state is full of cars and trucks with over 300,000 miles that are still going. Maybe not going strong, but still going nonetheless. And don't even get me started on all those million-mile semi-trucks that are still on the road today. So that got me thinking, does mileage matter when you're buying a used car? Every time I see a car advertised for sale, the mileage is mentioned. If it has low mileage, you can bet there's a sticker advertising that fact on the windshield. So why is everyone so obsessed with mileage? So there are three reasons why people use mileage and want to know the mileage when they're buying a used car. Reason number one is that mileage is a measure of the usage of a vehicle. The more miles driven, the longer it's been driven, the more use that it's gotten. It's also an indicator of general wear and tear. If you think about your maintenance intervals, those are typically given in mileage. And so over time, as you're driving, the engine is slowly wearing down, the transmission, the drivetrain, the tires. And what's nice about mileage in a car, if it hasn't had a bunch of parts swapped onto it, we'll get into that later. But when the car is driving down the road, all of the parts are being worn down, they're being used. The suspension, the steering, the tires, the transmission, and the engine. If the vehicle isn't going anywhere, isn't driving, but the engine is on, then yeah, the engine is getting more wear than the rest of the vehicle, but overall, assuming normal use and a normal amount of engine idling, then the mileage will correspond to the wear and tear and the overall condition of the vehicle. And so that's the third reason, is that it's applicable to all parts of the vehicle, not just the engine. Of course, odometer mileage does have its limitations. So let's discuss some of the limitations of relying on the odometer to keep track of mileage, and especially when you're using that odometer mileage to make decisions about purchasing a vehicle. The first reason why maybe the odometer isn't always right and isn't always the best tool to use is odometer fraud. Now, odometer fraud used to be a lot more common. Even when digital odometers first appeared, it was easy to hack them and display whatever mileage you wanted. And if you were really clever, you could rig it up so that it would go up by 1 mile every time a car drives 1.2 miles. A small enough difference that no one would notice during the day-to-day, however, those miles would add up. So if you pick up a car with 20,000 miles, then you did this, and kept the car for 5 years, put 50,000 miles on the odometer would actually only display 60,000 instead of 70,000 miles. That may not seem like a big difference, but if the unsuspecting person typically buys a vehicle and then every time their old one reaches 100,000 miles, they sell it and buy a new one, they'll think that the car has another year on it than it actually does. And of course, if the device isn't removed, the more and more miles that rack up, the bigger and bigger those discrepancies become. Nowadays, odometer fraud is a lot less common. The manufacturers put safeguards in place so it's harder to trick the odometers. Companies like Carfax and dealerships are constantly on the lookout for odometer fraud, and recording the mileage during all their inspections, reporting it to Carfax, and Carfax is keeping track of the mileage. So if suddenly the mileage drops or something's weird with that, it can be caught. Also, the penalties for odometer fraud have increased, and the amount of enforcement, the amount of money that's going into the Department of Motor Vehicles for each state to enforce odometer fraud laws has also increased, and so states are really cracking down on odometer fraud. For most people, the extra couple $100 that you would get by having a car with lower miles just isn't worth the fines, the civil liability, and the possible jail time. There's many reasons why odometers are just a poor measure of usage. First, city miles versus highway miles are not equal. Generally, a car that's getting more miles on the highway, those miles have less of an impact on wear and tear. Stop and start traffic, slower speeds, and especially when you're turning the car on and off a lot, that wears down the car a lot faster. With engines especially, the number of heat cycles can really impact the life of an engine. And that is why you see semi-trucks, long-haul semi-trucks, with much higher mileage than you'd see on any kind of passenger car or pickup truck. Now, there is some differences because of the reliability of diesel engines, and these companies generally take better care of their equipment. They have regular maintenance, but still, the miles on the highway are not as rough on a car as miles in the city or in a town. So heat cycles produce more wear and tear. Road conditions, loads, driving style, and off-road or track use all can impact all the different components of a car. And so if a car has seen excess heavy loads, the suspension is going to wear down faster, the engine is going to wear down faster, the transmission. If you're in an area where the roads are particularly bad, if you drive mostly on dirt roads with a lot of potholes, that is really going to impact your steering and suspension. Of course, off-road use, track use are going to wear down a vehicle faster. And with mileage, with an odometer, the amount of time that the engine has spent idle is not factored in. That is where something like a Hobbs meter, which keeps track of the number of hours that an engine is running for, can be useful. Now, in normal cars, the amount of idling is about the same, but especially if you have a purpose-built work truck or things like police cars and ambulances, those vehicles spend a lot more time idling than they do actually driving. So whereas the suspension, the steering, the chassis, the transmission all have very low miles, the engine has a lot of hours on it, which can also impact the wear and tear of the engine specifically. And then in mechanical odometers, the vehicle reversing is not counted towards is not recorded towards the mileage. Now, it doesn't make the odometer count backwards and go down.
The miles aren't coming off. The miles aren't coming off, going in reverse.
Huh. Well, I thought that might be a problem. Just have to crack open the odometer, roll it back by hand.
But it's still not counted toward the overall mileage. So if there was a situation where the vehicle was driven in reverse a lot, those miles wouldn't be counted. The odometer might still be a poor indicator of the general wear and tear of a vehicle and may not be applicable to all parts of a vehicle. For instance, regular maintenance slows wear and tear. So you could have two vehicles with the same mileage, but one has received regular oil changes, a transmission fluid flush when it's supposed to, the other one has just been completely ignored. Obviously, those two vehicles are going to be in very different conditions. Also, remember that a vehicle that is sitting can still degrade. In fact, it can degrade quite quickly. So, the vehicle might have low miles, but if it's been sitting for 5 years, and that's the reason why it has low miles, then it's still going to be in a sorry state. And even the non-consumable parts can be replaced. You can swap out engines, axles, etc. And now the different parts have different mileages. So, what can we do about that? Well, until all the parts come with their own systems of keeping track of mileage and install and service dates, maybe they'll put RFID tags in brake pads and a sensor in the calipers, so that when new pads are installed, the date and the mileage are recorded. And if you put in a new transmission, maybe like a crate transmission, the car's computer will recognize it and be like, hey, this is a new part. I'll make note of that. Maybe major components like a transmission in the case will have flash storage, so that the car writes the mileage to this flash storage periodically. So if that transmission is ever removed from that car and used in something else, the computer can then read that flash storage, be like, oh hey, this transmission already has 100,000 miles on it. And then it can keep track of the miles that are added on while not erasing the history of the miles that it already has. It can make its own count, basically creating a mileage report for each individual component. Until that overcomplicated mess comes to fruition, and if anyone wants to patent that idea, let me know. I'd be willing to sell it. I would say that mileage is a tool like pliers. They're a good tool, but inexperienced people tend to overuse them when there are better tools for the job. Take mileage into account, but don't substitute it for a thorough pre-purchase inspection. If you don't have the mechanical knowledge to do the inspection, find someone who does. At auctions, in general, most of them have a disclaimer saying that they cannot verify the odometer readings and verify that they are accurate. But don't be alarmed, because that's more of a liability waiver on their part, so that you can't sue them if you later find out that the odometer reading is not accurate. So I wouldn't be too worried when you see that warning. It's pretty standard. How do I deal with mileage on a car? Well, I definitely take odometer readings into account when I'm thinking about purchasing a vehicle, but I rely more on my own mechanical knowledge to create an assessment of the car's overall condition, see what I can tell about how well that vehicle was maintained, and create an idea of what that vehicle is worth now. For construction equipment, farm equipment, and old military vehicles, I don't really rely on the odometer readings at all. I just go based on what I can see about their condition. So I have to have an extra section on odometers on military vehicles, because actually the largest perpetrator of odometer fraud in the US is actually the US military. Now, I don't know if that's changed, but back in the day, the US Army didn't care about the mileage of their trucks. They'd drive them till the wheels fall off, put new wheels on, and drive them again. So aside from regular maintenance of critical items, repairs were generally done to return the truck back to mission capable, especially in times or areas where things are in short supply. And I'm not even talking about in-theater operations like in a combat zone. If you have to ship all your parts and vehicles all over the world to maintain permanent bases, even if you are creating giant stockpiles of vehicles and parts in West Germany during the height of the Cold War, odometer cables don't seem like an important enough thing to keep in stock. So the only way to fix it would be to request one when needed and wait for the order to come in. And that general attitude trickled down. If I'm in charge of a large motor pool, I'm probably not going to waste my mechanic's time and keep a vehicle out of service to do those repairs. Also, the odometer not working would have to be reported in order for it to be fixed. If I'm a technician doing a routine service, I'm not driving the truck more than a tenth of a mile, so I won't know that the odometer is not working. Unless I look in the paperwork and see that, hey, the mileage hasn't changed since the last service. That's weird. And then if I'm a driver that drives the same truck every day, I don't want the truck out of service for an extended period of time for something that I don't see as super important. So even if I report the issue, I'd probably wait until the next preventative maintenance and report it then. Of course, by then, who knows how far I've driven. Also, mileage is important to civilians because it's indicative of an overall vehicle's wear. But I already discussed how that becomes a moot point when you start swapping engines and transmissions. The military way of repair, and I've talked about this before, I don't know if it's changed, but in vehicles like my M35, the military engine service manual says that if there's a problem with the engine, you remove the engine and transmission, you put it on a rotisserie, then you put a different engine in there. Maybe you keep the same transmission, maybe you swap the transmission. Maybe that transmission has always been paired with that engine, but maybe not. And then you tear apart the engine in a very systematic way until you get down to the part that you need to fix, and then you fix that part, put the engine back together, and put it on the shelf for the next time you need an engine. After testing it and the break-in period and stuff like that, of course. But this constant swapping of parts means that the engine miles may not be the same as the frame miles. One axle might have more miles than the other. So many issues that the odometer really doesn't mean anything anymore. That is why I said in my video on how to buy a used military vehicle that the mileage doesn't matter on a used military vehicle. Construction equipment can also have this problem, although this issue is more likely to be with a Hobbs meter, which measures the number of hours that an engine has been on. Basically, if I'm running a construction company, I don't want my $500,000 excavator sitting around not making me money while I'm waiting for a new Hobbs meter cable to be installed. And especially with old equipment, I'm not going to bother doing that repair if it's not necessary. That's why odometer readings and Hobbs meter readings don't matter as much to buyers at a construction auction. I also wanted to point out here that it's kind of hard to conceptualize what an hour meter means. What I mean by that, I don't mean that hours are hard to conceptualize. What I mean is, growing up and buying different cars, you start to understand the concept of what a vehicle with 100,000 miles, 200,000 miles, 300,000 miles looks like, what kind of problems you expect to see, what condition that vehicle is going to be in. And if you don't have that, it's easy enough to find out with a little bit of Google. You'll find lots of opinions on what is a high mileage vehicle and what vehicles you should look for and what mileage range and what problems you would expect. However, what does 517.7 hours mean for a John Deere Gator? Is that a lot or a little? I have no idea. Now, over time, you'd probably get better at understanding it. It's sort of like learning a different language. But since most other vehicles use mileage, that's kind of what everyone is familiar with.